illiterates. They're scholars like Manan Wani, teachers like Riaz Neku, students like Burhan Wani. So these dirty tactics India employs to discredit any conversation on Kashmir that isn't in their favor is nothing new to us. I've experienced it my whole life, especially over the last couple of weeks, as most of you might know. The way that Kashmiris understand this motion. Rejected! Rejected!
Point of order. Only the member recognized will be allowed to speak. If you continue
Rejected! Rejected! The way Kashmiris understand this motion is in the context of UN resolutions and the UN Charter, which is the right to self-determination. I won't be arguing for a final settlement, as it would discredit and dishonor those who fought and sacrificed for the right to decide, be it independence, be it for Pakistan, even for India. So the opposition shouldn't have a problem now that the language has changed. Now the Indian team will claim and have claimed that Kashmir is their integral part, that the Maharaja signed the instrument of accession affirming that Jammu and Kashmir joined the Indian Dominion in 1947. But for the people of Kashmir, the right to decide their freedom isn't an arbitrary desire. And in fact, it predates the birth of India, at least since 1931. Now, the opposition has regurgitated 7 decades of propaganda presented as history in an attempt to whitewash and justify India's occupation and crimes in Kashmir. And I don't know if you've been briefed by the Ministry of External Affairs and their affiliates, so I won't accuse you of peddling the government line. And instead, I'll question your real-world knowledge and understanding of Kashmir beyond the prism of hyper-nationalism. So context. India does not believe in forced marriages. And in the context of forced marriages, we now hear BJP leaders like Vikram Saini urging Indians to marry fair-skinned Kashmiri girls as if our women are commodities. And comments like that aren't a one-off. Another BJP leader, Vikram Randhawa, called for Kashmiris to be skinned alive. And these aren't the only examples, and I have them right here. If anybody wants to dispute them, you can have a look at them right here. And these aren't the only examples, and not from 1947 like the Jammu genocide where 500,000 people were killed and 250,000 people disappeared in a couple of weeks. And that's reported by the editor of The Statesman, Ian Stevens. These are recent examples that I'm giving. 18th-month-old Hibba Nisar shot with pellets and blinded while she sat in her mother's lap. Journalists like Fahad Shah, Qazi Shibli, Sajjad Gul and Asif Sultan jailed for years for doing their job. 8-year-old Samir Rah, who was picked up, went out after he went out to play, and when his body returned home, it was indicated that he was beaten by military weapons. Mubina Ganai was raped and gang raped on her wedding night. Parveena Ahangar's son was a victim of enforced disappearance 30 years ago. She's still roaming around looking for him. 9-month pregnant Tamanna was 9 months pregnant when she was raped and gang raped by the Indian army and gave birth to a son 3 days later. 5-year-old Nasir was picked up by the Indian army, his eye punctured with a sharp object and sand poured into it. 2 entire villages of women aged between 8 and 80 raped and gang raped in front of their families and their neighbors. Qalandar, who had both his legs amputated and then force-fed his own flesh. Abductees tortured in mosques under loudspeaker to instill fear and terror in the population, happening in my hometown with my families. So don't tell me what the reality inside Kashmir is. Civilians used as human shields, and the officer responsible for it given an award. Kargo and Papatu are torture centers in Kashmir where pliers were used to pull people's fingernails out. Inmates electrocuted, sodomized, and rats used to feast on their scarred bodies. The burning of bodies and burying them in far-flung locations and not returning them to the families. Thousands of unmarked graves. I will not yield. PhD scholars like Ala Fazli jailed for an op-ed he wrote 11 years prior to being charged with terrorism and arrested. The murder and detention of legitimate political leadership under draconian laws. You must hear their names. Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani, Ashraf Sehrai, Mrs. Asiya Andrabi, Qasim Faktu, Mrs. Nahida Nasreen, Yasin Malik, Ms. Fahmida Sofi, Shabir Shah, Sarjan Barkati, Altaf Shah, former bar presidents Mia Qayyum and Nazir Ranga, even underage children aren't spared. And I won't even get into the transnational repression where India uses assassins to kill dissenters, home and abroad, including Kashmiris as well as Sikhs. As somebody was mentioning about Khalistan, I thought it's important to mention that it was Sikh, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, that was assassinated in Canada. A couple of months ago, even I was attacked on the streets of London after delivering a lecture and suffered a broken rib. And now, not recently, but quite a few years back, I was banned from traveling back to Kashmir. And in fact, we have so much more evidence that I'd like to submit this to you right now, if anybody would like to read it. So many... It's all here. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of thousands dead, tens of thousands raped, billions in destruction, widows, half-widows, which is a term coined more recently, orphans, and the list is endless. The heartbeat of Kashmir civil society, Khurram Parvez, quoted and cited by the United Nations, attempted to document as much as he could before being jailed and charged with sedition, of all things. That's the cost of counting. The cost of recording and the cost of the truth. Not to mention how lawyer Jalil Andrabi was arrested to prevent him from appearing before the United Nations as a representative of the Kashmir Commission of Jurists. His cut-up dead body was found in the river with a bullet to the head and his eyes gouged out. Let me ask the opposition. Is freedom to decide one's destiny a right or not? Is it justified? At what point is it justified? When a nation alien to your religion and culture invades you, when they mercilessly kill you, starve you, and rape you, when you're massacred, used as human shields, mass and unmarked graves, torture, controlling the media, creating puppet leaders and client regimes, draconian laws. So I ask you again, it isn't a rhetorical question. And in fact, I'd probably ask the entire hall here tonight. Do atrocities against the people on a scale that can only be described as war crimes and genocide justify resistance and freedom? Does it? You're raising your hand. It was a rhetorical question. Look, this is the problem. This is the problem of Indian hypocrisy and ultranationalism. This is the problem of Indian hypocrisy and ultranationalism. Because India fought the British for exactly those reasons. I wasn't describing Kashmir. I was talking about how the Indians fought, and they call us terrorists and terror sympathizers. I will not yield. Indians would have you believe that their freedom struggle against the British was justified and ours is illegal. And I remind you that they were a colonized people, and now they've become the colonizer, the irony. The future of Kashmir should be decided by the wishes and the will of the people. And both Pakistan and India were consulted and agreed to the resolution, yet India continues their violations. Now, according to Forbes, India have turned Kashmir into the most militarized zone in the world, with some estimates of 1 armed personnel to every 10 civilians. And they employ unimaginable draconian laws that give them impunity and destroy lives. I'll only take 1 more minute. This is what's led to the growth of indigenous groups like the TRF, PAFF, and Hizbul Mujahideen, lawfully engaged in a struggle for liberation, resisting the oppressor, and fighting to preserve our identity. It is our moral and legal right to resist by all means necessary, according to the UN documentation, which is right here. And those involved, as those involved in armed resistance, they aren't illiterates. They're scholars like Manan Wani, teachers like Riaz Neku, students like Burhan Wani. And finally, in closing, India gaslights anything that we say. So if you're convinced of their arguments tonight, you're convinced of ethno-religious nationalist supremacy. You can only endorse the Indian position if you believe Kashmiris are cattle to be dictated to and slaughtered with no mind of our own and no rights. What's worse, you'd be endorsing the view that human rights and international law do not matter. Look, I'm closing now. One of the major sins in Hinduism is injustice against others. At least let me quote from the Bhagavad Gita. At least let me quote from the Bhagavad Gita. Last minute. Tolerating injustice is much a crime as committing injustice. It is your duty to fight injustice.